What you just heard is the sound of a BMW E30 M3. In my opinion, one of the coolest cars ever made. The BMW 3 Series is a box. That's what it looks like. There's no other way to put it. It also looks like a daily driver, fitting in easily with the business casual atmosphere of ties, suits, and briefcases with the golf clubs in the trunk. Nothing special. A tool to get from A to B and then back to A. But if one takes a moment and looks closer at this box of a car, something special seems to emerge. The intense focus found in the headlights. Not overly aggressive, not mean, but it seems to have a purpose. The car seems to want to go. It hates stoplights and stop signs. The E30 can get you from A to B, but it will get this done and look good doing it. Yes, it's a boxy car, but it's no Kia Soul. It has a sleekness to it and a uniqueness to it. The E30 is a true 80s car, but I think that's why I like it so much. The fact that it's so unspecial is what makes it special. Maybe when it first came out, this car wouldn't turn any heads, but I'll tell you, nowadays, if I see one of these on the roads, I get very excited. The 3 Series was produced from 1982 to 1994. At launch in 1982, there were several models available to customers. These included the 316, the 318i, the 320i, and the 323i. And these models covered a wide range of power options as well as engine configurations. If you wanted something with not much power, then your best options were the 316 and the 318i. Starting with the 316, this model used an M10 B18 engine fed by a carburetor. It was able to produce 89 brake horsepower at 5,500 RPM and 103 foot-pounds of torque at 4,000 RPM. Looking at the engine itself, the M10 B18 was a single overhead cam 4-cylinder cast iron block aluminum head engine. Throughout its life, it ranged from 1.5 liters of displacement to 2.0 liters of displacement. An interesting fact is this was actually BMW's first 4-cylinder engine since the BMW 309, which ended its production in 1936. The M10 started its production in 1962, so there was a large gap where BMW simply was not using 4-cylinder engines. Before I go any farther, I also want to go over the naming conventions that BMW uses for both their engines and their vehicles, as this gives a little more understanding when I'm just reading off essentially a serial number. For engines, it tends to be an M followed by a number, and that number represents the engine series. A B in the name of the engine represents a petrol engine, and this is due to, in German, petrol is Benzin, and so when they produced a petrol engine, BMW would throw a B in there. And the last numbers associated with the name of the engine was a displacement. So for example, if we take the M10 B18, which is used to power the 316, it is an M10 series engine. It is petrol due to the B being in there, and it has 1.8 liters of displacement. As for the naming convention for the vehicles, the name of the vehicle is usually a 3-digit number followed by some letters. The first number represents the series of the vehicle. The next two represent the engine displacement in cubic centimeters divided by 100, and the letters represent something about the vehicle. A few interesting letters that can be used are I for fuel injection, D for diesel, H for hydrogen engines, S for sport, and T for hatchback. There are lots of other letters that can be tacked on to the end, but those are what I thought were the interesting ones. Another thing to note is that these naming conventions, both the engine naming convention and the vehicle naming convention, are not always used. There are some engines that have other names, and there are vehicles that have other names that do not follow these patterns or conventions. Back to 1982, when the E30 was first produced, the next level of power that one could get would be the 318i, This model of the E30 also used an M10 B18, but instead of being carbureted, it had fuel injection. And this was good for a big boost in horsepower. It went up to 103 brake horsepower instead of the 89 associated with the 316 model. It also significantly improved the fuel economy of this model as the engine was simply more efficient. After the 318i, we have the 320i and the 323i. Both of these models use a straight 6 engine configuration. The 320i is able to produce 123 brake horsepower, while the 323i is able to produce about 137 brake horsepower. This is due to the 323i having a larger displacement straight 6 versus the 320i. Over its life, the E30 would have a total of 14 different models. All of these models were available in 4-speed and 5-speed manual transmissions, as well as 3 and 4-speed automatic transmissions. And another interesting thing to note is that most of the models had disc brakes on all 4 tires, which is pretty performance oriented. That's not even very common these days. However, some of the lower power 4-cylinder models, they did have drums in the back, which is definitely more of a conventional setup. Obviously, I'm not going to go over every single one of the models. They're not all that interesting, and some don't have very noteworthy changes, but we will go over some of the big ones. The first being in 1987, a new engine was actually put into the E30s. This engine was the M40. It was very similar to the M10 engine used in the 316 and 318i models. It was a 4-cylinder cast iron block with an aluminum head. The only major difference between these two engines is the older one, the M10, has a chain-driven camshaft, while the newer one, M40, has a belt-driven camshaft. Another interesting change was the introduction of the 318IS model in 1989. This model had one of the most advanced engines to ever be put into these cars. The engine was referred to as the S14B20. It was a dual overhead cam 4-cylinder engine. An interesting thing to note is that the engine was based off of the M10, as in it was 4 cylinders, but it actually utilized the head from a 6-cylinder engine called an S38, with the 2 cylinders removed. So obviously the head is quite a bit bigger than it needs to be, and so they just chopped off those 2 cylinder ports in the head to allow this meeting between the 6-cylinder head and the 4-cylinder block. This configuration in the 318IS was good for 189 brake horsepower. However, an even higher displacement version of this engine was used in the M3 Sport Evo models of the E30. For those that don't know, the M tag is used to represent BMW's performance vehicles, their top-of-the-line racing vehicles. So this version of the engine was able to produce 235 brake horsepower at 7,000 RPM. This ends up being the most powerful engine ever put into an E30, and only 600 of these M3 Sport Evolutions were made, and they were a very different breed from the other E30s. For starters, it was lower and had taller front fenders. BMW also tripled the steering caster angle, added stiffer springs, and improved the shocks to help with handling. It even had thinner glass, a more open grille, and ducts added where there were fog lights on the previous models to help with cooling. In fact, the M3 version of the E30 and the standard version of the E30 only shared the hood and sunroof. All other body panels were different. This was all done in an attempt to improve the M3 aerodynamics. It should also be noted that there were previous M versions of the E30 before the Sports Evolution. The first M3 was produced in 1986, however the Sports Evolution was the most powerful ever produced. By the end of its production in 1994, a total of 2,433,000 E30s had been produced. However, not many of these were the breed of M3s, because M3s were specifically designed for racing. And the question that at least I had was, did it work? Did the new, more performance-oriented E30 in the form of an M3 work well at the task it was given? And the simple answer was yes. Originally, the M3 was designed for Group A touring car racing, and the good news for that is in order to qualify for Group A racing, a minimum of 500 cars needed to be sold to the public. So that means that the public actually could get their hands on M3 cars. This also explains why not many of the sports evolutions were made, because it wasn't necessary. BMW wanted these cars to race, and they simply had to produce enough to qualify for racing. So yes, in theory, you could find a sports evolution to own, but they are incredibly rare due to so little of them being made and them being extremely well-designed cars. Back to the success of the M3, like I said, it was extraordinary. In fact, the M3 has won more road races than any other model in history, and these cars absolutely dominated the competition, taking wins at the 24 Hours of Nürburgring, Spa 24 Hours, and multiple rally car championships. In conclusion, despite its maybe lackluster looks, the E30 is an incredible car. It has an insane racing pedigree. I personally think it looks good, and I mean, if you can find one of these, I'd buy it immediately. Thanks for listening. I hope to do more episodes on different cars. If you want any specific cars or recommendations for improvement, please let me know, and feel free to leave a review. Thanks for listening.